Alright, good morning. It's Monday. Here's the official lesson for you. I have Logan coming up first, who covered the Red Scare, which happened in the post-World War I, and it's going to relate back to the Soviet Union and the fact that they became a communist nation. So I'm going to let Logan take over, and I'm going to mute myself as I was doing on Friday. Here we go.
This scare started growing after the communists took power in Russia in 1917. Many Americans began to fear communist ideas. They were very worried that they might try and make a move and gain power. They were even more worried when millions of American workers went on strike in 1919. Many Americans blamed the communists. These attitudes led to a Red Scare, a time of fear of communists. The Red Scare started in April 1919 when the U.S. postal workers found bombs in several packages. The packages were going to get sent to famous Americans. They never found out who sent the bombs, but they assumed that they were in the Communist Party. In June, a bomb did go off, and it was outside the home of an attorney, General A. Mitchell Palmer. Palmer did respond by setting up police raids and trying to break up their party. The Palmer Act. Government agents arrested thousands of suspects, most of the time without evidence. Palmer also frightened the public by warning them that something bad may happen. They were planning a revolution.
The Red Scare led to one of the best-known criminal cases in American history. In 1920, police arrested Italian-born anarchist Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti for the robbery and murder of a factory firemaster and his guard. Although both of the men declared themselves innocent of the crime, Sacco and Vanzetti were found guilty. To be an anarchist, by the way, sometimes anarchist is associated with communism as well.
ACLU. The ACLU was an American Civil Liberties Union founded in 1920 to defend people's civil rights, tried unsuccessfully to get the verdict overturned. The two men were convicted. Their lives came to an end very quickly as they were executed in 1927. Causes of the Red Scare. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which led many to fear that immigrants, partially from Russia, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe, intended to overthrow the United States government. The end of World War I, which caused production needs to decline and unemployment to rise. Labor strikes, including the Boston police strike in September 1919, contributing to fears that radicals intended to spark. World War I, which led many to embrace strong nationalist and anti-immigrant sympathies. Fun fact, the president during the 1920s was Woodrow Wilson. The first Red Scare was sparked by fear and suspicion, widespread strikes, and a series of terrorist attacks in the homeland. In 1919, there was a massive wave of strikes in America in what was called the Red Summer. By the end of 1919, there was more than 3,600 strikes involving over 4 million workers.
All right, nice job, Logan. I'm going to pause, or you pause it here if you need to get down your 3, 2, 1. Just a reminder, I forgot to say it at the beginning. If you need to grab your notebook so you can get your 3, 2, 1 answered there as well, cool. It might not be a bad idea to do that so you could type it later if that's easier for you. But go ahead and pause it so you can do that. And moving on to Keegan, who had race riots of 1919.
The race riot of 1919. What is it? The 1919 race riot is a racial outbreak that occurred in Chicago, Illinois. It was a black militia protesting against the whites. It was also called the Red Summer because of how many people got harmed and lots of blood was everywhere. There were many terrorist attacks from the whites to the black, which included lynching, burning houses and buildings, and racial slurs. Why did it happen? On July 27th, 1919, a black teen drowned in Lake Michigan after violating the unofficial segregation of Chicago's beaches. He was stoned by some white kids until he finally drowned to death. The black family tried to call the police to try to get these kids arrested for assault and murder, and the cop was white, of course, and refused. This caused a spark of riot to the blacks. This menace happened for about a week. Important events. These riots ended on August 3rd. There were 38 deaths, 23 blacks, 15 white, 537 people were injured, and 1,000 black families made homeless. The KKK was still around and performed 64 lynchings in 1918 and 83 in 1919. In the summer of 1919, race riots would break out in many different cities besides Chicago. The city's African American population had increased from 44,000 in 1909 to more than 100,000 as of 1919. Competition for jobs in the city were much more competitive. Important people. There were not too many important people involved besides President Woodrow Wilson, who later came out to say it was all the whites' fault for all of this madness. KKK, a white supremacist group who terrorized and treated African Americans very poorly. Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago while the riots were happening. Where did this take place? Chicago, Illinois, Lake Michigan, Beach in Chicago, South Chicago in the suburbs and in the city. Impacts on society. Chicago was the first of its black population to double in 1915 and 1920, with most new arrivals coming from the South and settling in the neighborhoods below downtown. Whites also worried about the black vote. In April 1919, black voters aligned with the Republicans since Reconstruction. The whites soon began getting scared and nervous that the blacks would be taking over and overpowering the white race. Impact on society continued. Letting the blacks move into the city clearly caused some rampage. Most white people hated the blacks, so they did everything they could to try and hurt or even kill them. The thing is, blacks were not allowed to retaliate or to fight back because they would be lynched, stoned, or beaten to death. Even if it was for self-defense, a black could not hit a white. History around the event. Some history around the event includes racism. Racism still occurs today. This is such a big deal in this time period because blacks were not treated the same as whites, so whites loved messing with them and breaking all their valuables. Segregation was still a thing, and the African Americans were not treated as fairly as the whites at all. Summary. The Chicago race riot of 1919 was such a big deal in the early 1900s. There were other riots that were occurring at the time too, but none were as drastic as the Chicago riots. Rank.
Nice job, Keegan. Moving on to our next presentation. As always, pause here if you need to get stuff written down. We're going to move on to Izzy.
1920s women's suffrage. What was the women's suffrage? Women's suffrage was a movement that took about 100 years to receive what they were fighting for. Their goal was to get women the right to vote. Why did this event occur? This event occurred because women wanted the ability to vote and have a say in their political thoughts. Important events. In 1848, people gathered in New York to talk about the issues of women's rights. In the 1850s, the movement kicked off, but then shortly after plummeted due to the Civil War. Then, in 1869, a group was formed called the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was founded by Lucy Stone. Finally, on August 18th, 1920, they finally got the 19th Amendment, which says women have the right to vote. Impact on society. Since women received the right to vote, many jobs were filled by women. However, they didn't receive the same amount as men did. Social-wise, the women's suffrage movement allowed higher expectations for all women. Furthermore, in the 20s, were able to attend college and train for jobs men could have. Still, however, not getting paid the same as men. The people involved were Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretta Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Alice Paul. Where did it take place? This event took place in the United States. In the beginning of the movement, it began in New York, then sprouted up everywhere where women felt like they were being treated unfair. History occurred during the event. The main history event was the movement itself. However, the Civil War occurred during this movement and halted the women's suffrage movement for a little. What happened after the movement was successful? After the 19th Amendment was made, women began to see change. For example, women could vote, get jobs, study professions in college, and more. The women's suffrage movement led to women being able to seek out their dreams.
All right, that was Izzy. Pause here if you need to finish writing some stuff down. Speaking of women's suffrage movement, there's a really good movie called Iron Jawed Angels that is about that, all the struggles. So it kind of focuses on those women that Izzy mentioned. It's a pretty good watch, just if you're interested. All right, moving on to our next person, which is Maggie.
The Harlem Renaissance. What is it? What happened? Throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance occurred. The Harlem Renaissance was a period of African American artistic accomplishments. Many of the African American artists, writers, and activists spoke, wrote, or painted about the struggles in their lives in Harlem, New York. These struggles were violence, discrimination, the slang, jazz, African American women in the world. Important events. The Great Migration of many African American people started bringing them to Harlem, New York in 1915. White people became jealous of the nightlife of African Americans, but wanted to be separate from them and built their own underground ballrooms and speakeasies. In 1927. Those were called, the first big one was the Cotton Club. Black actors were brought to Broadway in 1929, and the Harlem Renaissance started to dissolve because of the stock market crash in 1929, the Great Depression in August 1929, the end of Prohibition in 1933, and the Harlem Race Riot in 1933. People. Langston Hughes created poems, plays, and books about African American life, often used slang, jazz music, and other ordinary things in their lives. Claude McKay was a poet and activist who wrote about the African American life in Harlem, New York. She spoke lots about discrimination and violence. Zora Neale Hurston was a writer during the Harlem Renaissance, and she frequently wrote about the struggles of African American women that she has encountered. Paul Robeson was an actor and singer and activist during the Harlem Renaissance. He believed arts and culture were the way out of African American struggles and discrimination. Aaron Douglas was a Harlem Renaissance artist. His paintings and illustrations and murals inspired many African American people. Augustus Savage was an artist whose clay sculptures were influenced by African American people and helped Black artists in the Federal Art Project. James Van Der Zee was a photographer during the Harlem Renaissance and showed the life of many African American people in Harlem, New York. Marcus Garvey was a nationalist who showed what was wrong with the saying separate but equal, and he was targeted by the FBI because of his belief of this. People. Many singers and tap dancers found work in speakeasies at night and other African American enjoyment. These people and tap dancers were Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, Fats Waller, Cab Calloway, John Bubbles, and Bill Robinson. Impacts. The Harlem Renaissance was the stage for the civil rights movement. It gave pride to all the African American people's work worldwide and set apart stereotypes of African American people and white people. Summary. The Harlem Renaissance can also be referred to as the Harlem Movement or the Negro Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a time of artistic accomplishment for the African American community in the 1920s and early 1930s. Many writers, poets, and singers, novelists, and activists wrote, spoke, and sang about the lives of African Americans in Harlem, New York. The stock market crash, Great Depression, end of Prohibition, and Harlem Race Riot ended the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance set stage for the civil rights movements and worldwide appreciation for the African American art. And my bibliography. Thank you.
All right, nice job, Maggie. Speaking of Cab Calloway, one of the musicians from that era, let me give you a quick brain break from the movie Blues Brothers. It's a great movie, actually. But okay, then moving on. Sorry. Cab Calloway there, by the way, he is about, I think he's in his mid to early 70s, and that movie came out in like 1979, I think, or 1982 or something. It's an old movie for us, but he wasn't some old man back in the 30s. He was, a guy in his 20s and 30s making jazz that was really, really popular. So, all right, moving on to our last one for today, which is Bobby talking about baseball in the 20s. So I'll let Bobby take it away.
Baseball in the 1920s by Bobby Schillinger. On the rebound. In 1919, players on the Chicago White Sox were paid to throw the World Series. This is now known as the Black Sox scandal. 8 players, including the great Celso Jackson, were banned from the MLB. This was one of baseball's biggest scandals. And in the 1920s, they rebounded and became more popular than ever. Due to the rise in popularity, baseball became known as America's pastime. In the 1920s, dynasties would be created like the New York Yankees, and stadiums would also be built that would stay up for decades. The picture on the left is a picture of the old Yankee Stadium, which was built in the 1920s. It stayed up for a while. It was knocked down recently, and they built basically a copy of it. And the picture on the right is a picture of the Polo Grounds. It was built around 1907, really early 1900s, and it was used it was a famous stadium in the 1920s. Famous players in the 1920s. Babe Ruth was by far the most famous and best player in the 1920s. Other than him, Lou Gehrig, Rogers Hornsby, George Sisler, and Mel Ott were all very talented and popular ball players. Lou Gehrig was the first baseman on the Yankees, is known for playing in 2,130 consecutive games. The 2,130 consecutive games is second for most games played in a row. Cal Ripken Jr. has the most. Rogers Hornsby played for the Cardinals and played lots of different positions. He played basically every position except pitcher, catcher, and first baseman. George Sisler played first base for the St. Louis Browns, and Mel Ott was an outfielder for the New York Giants. Mel Ott started his career around 1926 so he wasn't known as much as the other players in the 1920s. Babe Ruth. In 1920, the Boston Red Sox sold a pitcher named Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees for $125,000. Babe Ruth went on to become the greatest baseball player of all time. He did things that were never before seen in the game and attracted lots of fans from around the country. Babe Ruth was so much better than everyone else that in 1920 he had the most home runs in the league by 35 homers. Babe Ruth played on the best team in the biggest city, and his success and popularity helped make baseball America's pastime. The picture at the bottom, the one on the left is him in a Red Sox jersey, and then it's a little transition to him to the Yankees. Murderers Row. The 1927 Yankees are considered to be one of the greatest teams of all time. They won 110 games and swept the Pirates in the World Series. Murderers Row featured Hall of Famers like Earl Combs, Tony Lazzeri, Lou Gehrig, and Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig aren't just Hall of Famers, but two of the greatest players of all time. Murderers Row also featured two Hall of Fame pitchers, Waite Hoyt and Herb Pennock. Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig were the two best players in baseball at the time, so it's kind of crazy for them both to be on the same team. They were really dominant. Radio's effect on baseball. Due to radios, people could start to listen to baseball games. Before radios, you had to go to a game to listen to it and know what's happening live. Some nights, you could listen to games halfway across the country. Radios changed the way fans could root for their team and experience games. Imagine if we didn't have TV and we can watch the Blues or the Cardinals. It's kind of like they finally got to listen to their teams, and they could listen on some away games too. Like, say if the Cardinals were in New York on a clear night, they would be able to listen to the game. So that was really changed the game a lot and attracted a ton of fans. Baseball as America's pastime. The 1920s made baseball America's pastime. Babe Ruth helped out a lot and put them above other sports as America's pastime. Babe Ruth's popularity and talent did a lot for baseball, but him being outgoing and talking with kids did a lot for the game too. Things like sports sections in newspapers, radios, and the Negro League also increased baseball's popularity. The Negro League let people who aren't allowed to play in the MLB play baseball. Sorry about that. Play baseball and help create a love for baseball among African Americans. The World Series champions of the 1920s are in 1920 the Cleveland Indians won, in 1921, 1922 the New York Giants won, in 1923 the New York Yankees won, 1924 the Washington Senators won, in 1925 the Pittsburgh Pirates won, in 1926 the St. Louis Cardinals won, in 1927 the New York Yankees won, in 1928 the New York Yankees won, in 1929 the Philadelphia Athletics won. In the 1927 New York Yankees team was the Murderers Row team. Summary. In 1919, the Black Sox scandal really hurt baseball. In 1920, Babe Ruth went to the Yankees and started to hit home runs at a pace never before seen. Babe Ruth's talent, popularity, and outgoing personality helped attract fans from all over the country. He became the greatest player of all time. Baseball games started to be played over the radio, so fans could listen to the game even if they weren't at the stadium. With Babe Ruth catching the attention of millions and radios letting people listen to the games, baseball became known as America's pastime. Baseball is not only loved by white people, but due to the Negro League, African American people started to develop a love for baseball. The 1920s not only built baseball up, it also prepared it for the future. The 1927 Yankees was the beginning of the dominant Yankees that would go on to win the most World Series out of any team. There were also stadiums built in the 20s, like Yankee Stadium, that would become very famous and last a long time.
All right, that's the last one for today. If you haven't already, CNN 10's been posted, so take it as a brain break. And have yourself a great day. I'll catch you tomorrow with our last couple presentations. Take it easy.